Okay, let's start. Do we have any news? I don't know. We stopped last time on FHIR pass DSL. Ryan, you presented. Do you want to add something else to it?
I guess I could bring up the slides just for reference to see where we left off, and if there's any. I think that's what it sounds reasonable. I didn't have additional content, although it was kind of rushed at the end. So we can start with. I can bring up the slides, or we can start with another topic if folks have something else in mind.
So we don't have a lot of topics today. I don't know, at least prepared. So I would suggest discussion about UUID. So I did some experiments with Postgres, but I think that it's valid for other guys. So if we use UUIDs for all the references, that may be interesting to normalize references. And as well as then propose to hashing external IDs. If you aggregate from different sources, we can use UUID version 5, which provide this algorithm. So it's to hash and then get UUID. As well in Postgres, if you store UUID as a UUID type, it take much less space, like 3 or 4 times than if it's like a string. So that may help as well. I don't know. What do you think, guys? Should we kind of recommend use UUID and restrict it for SQL and FHIR, or it's too much?
Remind me, Nikolai, from the data types across the various tools we're looking at, do all of them or most of them have a native concept of UUID different from a string?
Most of them. Yeah. I think the Postgres, Parquet, and pretty sure BigQuery. I don't know. Ryan, do you know BigQuery support native UUID type?
I'm actually not sure, but I mean, nonetheless, I think, it certainly supports string types, and so I think for any database that doesn't support UUIDs, then strings would fit the bill. So basically UUIDs and string fields.
Okay, that's and then I go more crazy, so I hashed through UUID the codings concepts. That works very nice. That allows you to compress the data, but this transformation probably is too much. But
yeah, it makes reading and writing pretty hard.
Yeah, but that's very nice because the UUID version 5 support like prefixed UUIDs and hash it. So if you use system and code or system code and version, so we can get always the same UUID for the same concept. But I don't know, it's too experimental.
Yeah, I can think of a lot of use cases that we really want to have some visibility into the codes and do like a lot of sort of value set based queries and import content probably from terminology services. So yeah, I don't think further compressing code values would make that quite difficult. So yeah, I'd be a little bit reluctant to go down that path unless we were able to work out these other items.
I have one comment or question on this. If you think about, the Parquet and the SQL will be downstream from what's already loaded into your FHIR server, right? So if this is a requirement downstream for SQL, what if it wasn't loaded that way? Because the upstream requirement from the base R4 isn't that restrictive.
Can you elaborate a little bit on it?
Maybe it's a non-issue. We are doing SQL on the Parquet downstream from what was already loaded in to the FHIR server. If we're saying we'll only accept a certain type of value coming through in certain areas, what if that value isn't in the base FHIR that was loaded stream, right?
You mean, for example, IDs are just the strings in a FHIR server, and we're forcing to have UUID.
If base R4 allows for more than UUIDs, right? If it allows strings and everything, then some in the community may have implemented it differently, right? So if we restrict it, are we going to have data loss? It's just my comment.
Yeah, that's true. So, but it's related to Dan's proposal. So he proposed to hash IDs when you're loading, because it's common case when you're loading from different sources. And the UUID version 5 algorithm allows you to convert any string, which could be in ID position, into UUID. So you wouldn't be able to restore the original ID, but you will be able to always get the same UUID from the same original ID.
Right. Ours does that automatically as it loads into the server. Like it's a string in the JSON before we load it, and then it becomes the UUID after. But I'm not sure if that's the same as what others in the industry have for their servers if they're converting.
This is just a proposal, so let's move this discussion further on GitHub. But for me, I think that this crazy idea that all resources should have unique IDs and UUID will work well for that. Because in the future, I can imagine that you will get two different databases and you want to merge them and search through this. And standardize this will kind of eliminate the potential clashes.
Yeah, I definitely agree with the wanting the desire to bring in like multiple FHIR stores perhaps to the same database and to avoid any collisions in terms of IDs. And I think that's so. So we can follow up on maybe in the chat we can share the specific GitHub issue and follow up on that space. I think that to Donna's question, my understanding of this is this wouldn't put any constraints on what is in the upstream FHIR store. So everything there could be as it is, but we basically be, and synthesizing a UUID field in the database model, or specifically for this purpose, for the purposes of joins and unique identifiers across these, which I think makes a great deal of sense. And particularly, like I know that in our experiments, we've seen a significant performance advantage if we can like do native joins against like raw IDs, as opposed to like having to parse out like the patient / 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, because that just prevents the query optimizer from doing a lot of nice stuff. So generally, I'm +1 to having some sort of simpler ID field that can be that is unique and reliably joined. I think we need to work out the mechanics of that, but I think it's a good idea.
Yeah, and then describe this kind of algorithm. I think I just did the next step, just bringing UUID version 5 to this picture.
A little bit on versions and versioned references before, but do we want to put this in scope? In other words, like if I have an observation that points to a patient in FHIR, that can point to a patient with a version specified or with no version specified. And do we want both of those things to work when we're importing data into this SQL and FHIR format? Like, do we want to have a way to express each of them so that they're consistent? Or do we want to leave that out of scope and just focus on versionless references?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. Do you see a lot of usage of this like versioned references?
I don't see a lot of it in like current systems. I'm just thinking about some of the use cases you're describing of wanting to maintain and merge data from different sources and make sure you avoid clashes. Well, one kind of clash that can happen is two resources share the same ID because they are different versions of the same resource. So if we want to deal with that, we might want to surface it in our metadata structures as well, but we could also just set it aside.
I don't have any opinion. What do you think? Because that's interesting to query the historical data, but I think this will complicate things a lot.
One consideration, I like that Josh pointed this out. If you think about the example of an observation needing to connect to the patient resource, but if you look at it from the big picture, we're going to be running SQL on payer data, administrative data that's already been loaded back to 2016. So you have patient coverage, your EOBs, plus any clinical data that they maintain as US core resources. And then if we add in clinical connectivity, where we're pulling in data directly from provider EHRs, we still may need to connect the observation coming from the provider EHR to the patient version for the payer versus just the provider, right? That would be if there's two patient resources on the same person that actually exist with different reference connections, that would be a scenario that would happen in, is if you're pulling in the patient resource from the provider EHR versus the payer's patient resource. May not matter, may be overcomplicating things, but.
I think Josh talking about the reference may include the version, yes?
Yeah, that's right.
And I'm still curious how we're going to handle it in SQL on FHIR. I think most of queries do not expect any historical versions of resources.
Yeah, so, I mean, it depends. Like if you're in the habit of always creating version references, it's not so much about being able to query historical state. It's about making sure when you do a join, you're joining to the version that was mentioned in the resource you're joining from.
Yeah, but if you imported only current versions of resources, so you wouldn't be able, yes, to join to the version.
Right. So like that would be an example of a simplifying assumption we could make to say in SQL on FHIR, we're only interested in the current versions of things. We might be interested in merging data across health systems, across FHIR stores, but not across history. And I would be fine with that. I just think we should call it out, and then we can avoid trying to account for some of those complexities in the design.
The current version of just R4 or the IG that is being used.
Donna, let me clarify. Yes, so in FHIR, when you update resource, so server may support like versioning, and it may keep the history of updated resource. So we are talking about the same resource, which is multiple time updated on the server, and it may have different versions on the server, and reference may point to specific version of this resource. And Josh is talking about, should we care about this version references, or we will put it out of the scope for the SQL on FHIR? I don't know.
I see.
Yeah, Ryan, what do you think about this?
Yeah, I think that this is so first of all, I think we should be deliberate and track and write these down. But my initial reaction is that this simplifying assumption sounds very appealing, and so yeah, I'd be inclined to make it, just because like most I can't think of a use case I've really had yet that would want to deal with the complexity of spanning historical versions. I'm not saying that they're not out there, but it doesn't seem like the complexity is justified based on the workloads I've seen and would anticipate.
Okay, Josh, can you imagine any use case for the queries which understand versions?
Well, that's a dangerous question, Nikolai. Of course, I can imagine some use cases. I mean, right, even something very simple like a patient who filled out a questionnaire. At the time they filled out the questionnaire, they might have chosen, FHIR questionnaires are very flexible, right? Some questions can have a number or a string or a date as an answer. Other questions can have a resource reference as an answer. And like they might have pointed to a specific version of the patient demographics where they had their home address stored. And when they filled out the questionnaire, like the answer was that home address. And you don't want in the future to pretend that they had filled out a questionnaire with a different home address just because their address had changed. Like some use cases care about that distinction, others don't. But like I said, I would be fine leaving out of scope. We just want to be clear about it.
Yeah, I agree. We should be very clear about it. I think that, So, but of course we can imagine use cases to Josh's point. At the same time, I think it would come, I'm just imagining like the level of complexity that would bring in not only from the joins, but also like maintaining state of the database itself. So for instance, if I have my patient, have a bunch of observations and I want to join to patient, and let's say I update my patient information, I mean, chances are I might want to just get the latest patient information, but those still historical observations would still apply. I mean, for like patient demographics or something like that. And so I most cases, I think I want to join with the current version across all those sorts of things. Whereas if I update a patient and if I were joining from observation to patient, do I have to go and update the references? It seems like there's a lot of hoops to jump through in that case. That makes me reluctant to go down that path.
Yeah, I agree. Craig, can you tell what you wrote?
Yeah, I was just thinking that, if you had, say, two different same patient as two different resources, one R3, one R4, to me, the ID should be definitely unique, the UUID. And then if you had use the identifier property to have an ID for the custom database or whatever the individual implementation is. And I think that could go for any resource. If you, say you were on R4 and you wanted R5, you wanted to copy all your resources, you would literally duplicate everything, but then give them new UUIDs. And so then any of the references would always be pointing to something of the same version with a unique UUID.
Okay, guys, any other topics to discuss? So I started the topic that looks like we converge to the set of transformation, the minimal set of transformations. So we have a discussion for that we all agree to parse references. We all agree at least to normalize date times, yes, and probably normalize it to periods. So just let guys participate in discussion. Let's pick this minimal transformation we think towards to have, and probably keep other more sophisticated transformation out of the scope, because so my preference is to keep it minimalistic as well. Yeah. But for example, to normalize two periods, I think we will probably need some meta information, because it's not, I don't think we can always understand that this element is polymorphic or union type and maybe daytime or period.
I think the date time, first of all, like a minimal set of transformations, strongly agree with that. And so really the ones that I see are basically the stuff we touch on. So how we deal with IDs, how we deal with references, and how we deal with date times, of varying specificity. Yeah, so and maybe those are all the transformations we need in this first pass. That would be nice. Yeah, but it does seem like the date time one is a bit more involved. I mean, I'm happy to kind of, I don't have an obvious answer on the best way to handle that. I think that Dan had some suggestions of maybe do we always convert every time we see like a date type? Do we always convert it to a start and an end, and with the appropriate specificity? I think that was sort of Dan's thinking, but I'm not sure if we can kick around ideas there, or if it's not clear right now, maybe if someone's interested in taking a pass at it, writing up a more concrete proposed specification for that we can review as a group, that might be productive as well. Because I really haven't put enough thought to have a good recommendation or idea of how to solve that at this point.
Thank you. Any other comments to this? So let's try to finalize and maybe put in the spec this minimal set of transformation, yeah? So at least we will have some artifact.
Yeah. Does anyone see the need for, so that we enumerated those three transformations, IDs, references, and date types. Does that seem sufficient for an initial pass, or do others see like needs that would need right out of the box?
Yeah, for me, that looks kind of reasonable. We still didn't decide what to do with contained resources, yes. So Dan's proposal was to kind of extract it from the resource and store into the resource tables.
Plus one to that, yeah, I definitely would. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Like trying to deal with arbitrary contained resources that would be hard to imagine. So yeah, definitely extract them. I definitely like the idea of extracting them out and putting them as separate resources.
I think one of the reasons, because for columnar storages, when you generate schema, it's pretty hard to generate the schema for contained resources. Yeah. So
there's only two other options. I don't like either of them, but just the things I've seen are, if your data are quite regular, like you've got a list of imaging studies and they all have an endpoint, and the endpoint always has the same shape. Like, yes, it's contained, but it always looks the same. That you can derive an okay schema for, but it's hard to know if you have that guarantee ahead of time. And then the other thing people frequently have done is just throw contained resources into a string. But when they do that, they tend to never look inside that string again.
That's the fifth transformation or fourth transformation possible. But it sounds a little bit complicated, because kind of the processing of contained resources, it's not so easy, yes. But yeah, let's discuss. And we can probably decide what ID should be assigned to this resource. We can do hash by resource content, I don't know, and apply UID, something like this. Or you use like the container resource ID somehow.
Yeah, I think the correct way to think about it is that a contained resource is fully identified by its container ID plus its own ID. So we can combine those two in various ways, as long as it's consistent. And we haven't talked about identifiers. I don't think we need to right now, but that we might learn that it will be useful to have some generic transformations to make identifiers easier to query, so you don't have to sort of look separately at the type field and the value field and the string system field.
Okay, yeah, so that's a good point. I mean, and I think a little bit I was sort of, we talk about IDs but not identifiers, but I mean, there's certainly use cases where if you have an your observation subject and the subject is, a patient, and there's very clear cases in which I want to join from my observation subject to my actual patient, which may just be an identifier. So like being able to join across from references to identifiers does seem like a key thing. So maybe it's like, we should probably add, I think we probably do need to add some sort of transformation to identifiers to the list to make joins easier as well as IDs.
I had one comment on the identifiers from an end user perspective. Keep in mind that say if someone at a health plan is wanting to query a specific patient, they're not going to know what that encrypted ID is or the transformed version of the number. They're just going to know the member's ID number, and that's what they're going to probably want to search by. So having that unpacked and accessible from the identifier array might be more valuable for the end user.
In my crazy experiment with UUID, you may guess what I did. So I hashed identifiers into UUID, and then you probably don't, because if you're joining, you don't care about what the type of identifier is. So, or you may care. And what do you think? Because we can generate UUID from identifier, and then it may behave almost like references.
Yeah, I think for selection, the type matters, but for joining, it doesn't. The join is basically, the system and the value. But
for selection, because the UUID algorithm is deterministic, yes, so you can easily search, at least if you can provide the system plus value. Because
right, but I mean, sometimes you want to select by type. Like if I want to find patients, Medicare beneficiary identifier, I might be able to do that by system alone. But if I want to find a patient's medical record numbers, those could have almost any system, but a consistent type. I wouldn't worry about any special handling for type, as long as it stays in the data payloads in a non-lossy way. We can query for it when we need it.
Yeah, but this UUID approach can be like denormalization, yes. So, but as we discussed, we're still not sure. Do we want to include such type of transformations like denormalizations into the core, or it could be the next level of transformation? But this may really simplify stuff. So when in my experiments, I hashed all codings, and I represented codable concept as a array of UUIDs, and identifiers UUIDs, and references UUIDs, and then like half of resource becoming just UUID set of UUIDs. And what's nice that you don't even care about the element name, because kind of UUID quite unique, so you can search through this array by code, by reference, and by identifier.
Yeah, the use cases where you want to find observations that mention a concept are not really that frequent. I mean, I understand it's a convenient shorthand to not worry about what field a data element occurs in, but there's a reason we have these data models that scaffold around the vocabularies, and we don't just say an observation is a bag of codes.
Yeah, I still kept them in elements, but for indexing, I just build a huge array of UUIDs and index it with reverse index.
Your query, though, would still refer to specific elements.
Yeah.
You're just thinking it would be served by this generic set type index.
Yeah.
All right, I'm with you.
Okay, guys, any other topics? We have George. George, can you introduce yourself, and maybe you have some questions too?
Well, no questions yet. Good morning. My name is George Michelson. I'm Vice President of Engineering Operations at Gorilla. So had a conversation with Nikolai last week. He mentioned this work group, and this sounds very, very interesting. So for now, I'm observing in all, listening and trying to make sure I follow all of the discussions. Trust me, questions will come, but not yet.
Thank you. Okay, guys, Any other topics for today?
Yeah, so I mean, I guess, in terms of, there's a couple paths that we can take to follow up here. One, I think we've enumerated a few things in this space. Go deeper into some of these. If there's like GitHub issues or if there's a volunteer to kind of that we can kind of review and determine if it's a good approach for each one of these items. I think that's one path that's worth pursuing from this discussion. And then I guess the other topic is that we could touch on a bit is like we discussed a little bit last time, is like, are there patterns for creating tabular views that would be portable between systems? We shared like a FHIR path-based approach. We could touch on that, and I don't have no major updates or anything in that space, but we could talk about how we might consider pursuing that as well. So Nikolai, what do you think? Should we split, or do we want to take a pass at kind of breaking these down, or just follow up on GitHub issues?
Yeah. Let's do this in GitHub discussions. So if you can create a discussion for this flattening DSL with some proposals and ideas, so that would be nice. And then I think for the connectathon, we can try to put it all together in some draft version of the specification, the transformations, the conventions, and these ideas, so to shape what we have.
Yeah, sounds good. Yeah, I can create GitHub issues specifically on the flattened views and subset of FHIR path approach, and we can follow up on that. And we can sync on these other topics and independent issues as well. And so I will definitely be at the Connectathon. So maybe we can bring those together as we get closer to that. Okay, so then thank you guys. See you next week, and hope to see you on Connectathon. So if not, you're not yet registered, so buy the ticket to New Orleans.
Thanks, Nikolai.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.